Heading down to Dallas, Texas, where we are chatting with Sarah St. John. She is an entrepreneur, podcaster, and an author. She runs the podcast Frugalpreneur, and she also has a podcast marketing agency, which you can find at podcastmarketing.agency. We're going to talk to her all about that and her journey in podcasting. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, what was your journey into podcasting in the beginning, right? What made you pick up a microphone and start doing this stuff?
Yeah, so I had actually written a book called Frugalpreneur, and I decided kind of at the last minute to create a podcast to coincide with the book. It was only going to be like 10 episodes though. And basically, I was interviewing the different CEOs or someone from the different companies of some of the different companies I talked about in the book, because the book is about like different ways to make money online and what tools and resources and software I recommend to do it on a budget or for free even. And so, but it was just going to be an extra marketing avenue or more exposure. But actually, the podcast did a lot better and took off more than the book did. And I love the connections I was making, the networking, the conversations, even the friendships. So I've kept it going, and it's been over 5 years now.
Awesome. And just for everyone listening, the book is Frugalpreneur, Building a Business on a Bootstrapped Budget. And I'm sure for podcasters, a bootstrap budget is a very common thing that they are working with. What were some of your early investments that you made to produce the podcast? And, where did you look to save money in doing so?
Yeah. So the podcast, I mean, the nice thing about having a podcast for your business is that I think a lot of people assume that it's expensive because they're thinking of it in terms of a broadcast studio, or a radio station. But you can obviously get started for under $100 for a podcast. I bought like the cheapest mic I could find, or the cheapest good mic, which was an ATR 2100. And then I started out hosting on Spreaker, which I think was free, and then I think it went up to like $7 a month or something. Now I'm on Captivate, but um, so really I was paying like under $10 a month to, pay the initial 60, 70, whatever for the mic. USB mic goes right into your computer. So yeah, the startup costs were very low. And I mean, obviously everybody in the podcast industry knows that, but I think people who are getting started, they assume that it's going to cost more than that. So
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of literature out there that talks about expensive home studios, expensive software, expensive talent, hiring engineers, hiring producers, all that stuff. But really, you can do it. I mean, really, if you have no budget, you can pick up your smartphone and start doing it. Now, it's not going to be the same quality as others, but right, there's nothing that can stop you from capturing content and putting it out there to get yourself started.
yeah, for sure.
What were some of the so you said you were having success with the podcast. What were some of the things that you did early on that you think led you to that success? Was it simply having the right content at the right time, or were there little tricks and tips and things that you were doing that really helped you out?
I think there were a few different things. I had different series, like topical series, like maybe for a week. I would put out an episode every day on the topic of podcasting, and then the next week maybe on self publishing. So I kind of had like topical, like mini series within the podcast that people I think seem to enjoy. But then also, I was able to get fairly big names pretty quick in, like Pat Flynn, John Lee Dumas, Mike McAllowitz, all that. And I think that also helped a little bit. At least with the authority factor, like the credibility of the podcast and whatnot. But yeah, so those are some things that I did. And I interviewed a lot of so my show, it's kind of a variety. It's like mostly interview style, but there's also some solo episodes, and then there's some that are maybe like a 5-minute episode about a particular software that I use and recommend to run my business on a budget. Um, but yeah, so just kind of I think the variety as well. It wasn't just one type of show. I think that kind of sparked interest. So like some people, if they're into interview style, they listen to those. Some people, if they like solo, shorter episodes, listen to those. So yeah.
Has the strategy or has your thoughts on how to podcast changed in those 5 years? Or, with the advent of new software, hardware, platforms, like what have been some of the changes you've seen in podcasting, and how much has that impacted the way you go about doing it?
Yeah, so probably it was over a year ago I had noticed that because I check my analytics every day. And I noticed that I suddenly had an instant increase in downloads, and I was trying to figure out, well, why was that? I mean, I go on other podcasts, but like I hadn't been a guest on some big podcast that would maybe, that many people would come over and download. So I was trying to figure it out, and so I told some podcast friends, and they actually looked on the charts, and I was in the well, at that day I was in the top 200, and then the next day it was like the top 100 in Apple Podcasts under entrepreneurship. And I was trying to figure out, well, why or how. Well, one thing that I noticed when going back through my analytics was that the episodes I had kind of leading up to that were much shorter. And so therefore they had a higher completion rate. Like people actually listened to like 90+% versus like, I don't know, 40 or 50% or whatever. Um, and so I assume that must have played some kind of factor. But so ever since then I still do long form interviews, but I do a lot more shorter episodes too because the completion rate is so much higher. So I guess that's one strategy or one thing that I'm starting to do differently is um more episodes that are shorter or like solo episodes.
Okay. When did you decide that you wanted to not just produce your own podcast, but then start to help others in the podcasting space?
So that's been kind of in my head for at least a couple years, but my initial thought was to do podcast production because I produce my own show, I always have. And I was like, well, I could get paid to do this for other people, but it just, my passion wasn't in it, I guess. I tried it and I was like, ah. So, but what I really enjoy and where my passion is in like the marketing side of things and finding out the different ways to get either more downloads, more listeners, or get publicity or PR for your podcast, things like that. And so that's now where I help people versus like the production end of things. And that's also been kind of good because there's tons of podcast production agencies, but I can think of less than a handful that I'm aware of like specifically podcast marketing agencies. And then I've reached out to different production agencies, that don't offer marketing services, to let them know that I could like, they could either refer me out and vice versa, or I could even white label for them or whatever. So I feel like it's kind of opened more opportunities or doors as well.
So, when you are approaching a client for the first time who wants to work with you as far as marketing assistance, what are some of the things that you are looking for, looking at? Like, I assume it's not a one size fits all strategy for everyone.
hmm Yeah, I mean, the first step is always an audit, I recommend, where I go through and just listen to their episodes, cover art, their descriptions, their show notes, their website, their social media presence, all of these different aspects, and kind of see where they could improve to, it could be as simple as a new cover art or whatever, but see where there's those initial areas that they could improve to either be more searchable and findable or me be more appealing and keep the audience listening longer and get people to actually share the podcast, refer the podcast out and say, hey, you need to listen to this podcast. Because I feel like word of mouth is definitely one of the best ways. Um, and then, looking at their marketing strategy and trying to find ways that either they can collaborate with other podcasters, whether it's like feed drops or promo swaps, or like maybe there's a newsletter that they could be in that's like, if their podcast is about a particular topic or niche, obviously. Let's say they have a podcast about pets or something. Because we were just talking about pets before we started, so that's why it's on my mind. But if there are other podcasts about pets, doing the whole drop and swap. But if there's newsletters about pets, finding a way to be in those newsletters or blog posts, or just different ways to get press for the podcast, for audiences that would be interested in that topic, of course.
What do you find in doing these audits that is the biggest mistake podcasters are making?
A lot of times it's cover art, because the first step really, I feel like, is cover art, because if someone's scrolling through a podcast player and your cover art doesn't stand out or get someone to click, then the rest is irrelevant. But I would say cover art, but also how they name the episodes. Um, that's also a big one. A lot of people will just have like the guest name on the episode title, or something like that, but it won't actually explain what they're talking about in the episode or what the listener will get out of listening. And then I would say those are the two big things. Also, maybe the description, it's not long enough. It's not SEO friendly, or there's more keywords that they could include. Um, Another mistake is people don't have a website for their podcast. Um, I would say those are kind of podcast. Um, I would say those are kind of very common issues.
So, I used to do podcast audits as well and talk to folks about marketing. And you said something that I think is very true, is that most of us discover or start to listen to a new podcast from the recommendation of others, right? Someone we know, like, or trust says, "Oh, hey, Sarah, I know you're into blah, blah, blah. You should check out this." Or you listen to a show from a trusted authority and they say, "Hey, I'm talking to Sarah on the podcast. You should check out her show." And right, that gives a lot of authority and convinces people to go over. As a podcaster, what do you think is the best way to turn listeners or anybody in your, potential network into your advocate?
So you could have, this is kind of tricky, but you could have some sort of like affiliate or referral program, though the only way that's going to work is if you have a product or service, to actually get people to refer just your podcast. I mean, that's kind of hard. But um, I think making like a game out of it, like um, even giving out shirts or stickers or whatever to different podcast listeners for them to either wear, and then that's how they, it's a free shirt for them, and your podcast is getting attention because they're wearing it, and someone might ask them about it. But just like rewarding, like giving a shout out, I think is a big one. Um, Whether it's on a podcast episode or in social media or email. Um, but yeah, just coming up with fun ways to kind of engage and interact, and even creating like you could have like a Voxer or fan list. There's these different platforms where you can like exchange voicemail, so to speak. I think that's also a good thing to do as well. Um, I think the more engaged you are with your listener, and the more likely they are to share, and maybe even do Q&A sessions as well. I know some people do that.
I always like the idea of, communicating with your listeners. A lot of folks think I'm in front of a microphone. This is a one-way street, but real successful podcasters, they do communicate, they do chat, they do engage with the folks who they work, who are listening to their show, who comment on their show, who like their show, who do anything to interact and let them know that they are there. And, creating that engagement, creating that relationship tends to pay dividends in the end. What are some of the new, or what are some of the upcoming trends in podcast marketing that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Okay, so this is one that it, that I've recently been talking about that I think is just a fun thing to do is like Times Square billboards. Yeah, with your cover art and then a QR code next to it. And you can a lot of people assume that getting a billboard in Times Square costs thousands of dollars, but it actually can be as low as 150. There's like different like welcome to timessquare.com, I believe, and there's like a handful of different companies that do this where it's a digital billboard and you can book a slot and basically it'll display your ad for 15 seconds every hour for 24 hours. And
And how much was that?
150.
Oh, that's nothing.
I know it is. It's nothing. And so I I recommend, if people are going to do that to try to go to New York or if you're already going to New York, plan it around your visit that you're already planning and then try to get like a selfie or video of you with it. But if not, they do have what do you call it? Like a live stream. I don't know. I was gonna say screen share, but that's yeah, a live stream of it.
So you can at least snap a shot of it. Like, do
Yeah.
you have a sense of when each hour it's going to happen, or it's luck of the draw?
No, yeah, you just know what day. And then of course it's for 15 seconds every hour. So yeah. You might have to stand around for a little bit, but
I mean, I'm going to be in New York tomorrow, so I'm just
oh,
going to be trying to do this. Well, I'll if I get this done, I'll share a link with everybody, and I'll share a screenshot of me in front of the billboard talking about what it is that we're going to promote on there. So that is very cool. Thank you for that resource, and we'll include a link so that you, the audience, can find it as well on your own and try to check that out. We are chatting with Sarah St. John, entrepreneur, podcaster, and author. As a reminder, the podcast and book are both titled Frugalpreneur. And if you are looking for some help with your marketing efforts, you can check out podcastmarketing.agency. So, Sarah, when we have people on the show, we always like to ask everybody the same three questions. And I'm kind of curious to get your take, especially given your time in the podcasting industry and how you work with others. So first off, I'm asking, is there a place where you would like to see improvement in podcasting overall, like whether it's discovery, distribution, things like that?
I would like to see Apple and the big ones, Apple, Spotify, and it might be Spotify is doing this now, but where you can actually like communicate with listeners, where they can comment on the episode. Um, I thought I heard Spotify might be doing that. I'm not sure if that's
There is now some commenting and messaging
okay.
features in the Spotify dashboard, and even if you don't host with Spotify, you can go and engage with your audience there.
Okay. Yeah, but Apple doesn't have that yet, so I think that would be nice. Um, there are some platforms like Good Pods and Podvine, although I'm not sure that Podvine exists anymore, where you can have engagement and communicate with your audience. I think that's the big issue with podcasting is just there's unlike say a blog or a YouTube video or something like that where people can easily comment. Most of the time with podcasts, at least on Apple Podcasts, you can't do that. And so that is what I would like to see change.
Okay. Uh, is there a piece of technology on your wish list, whether it's something that you know is out there that you need to get your hands on, or something that hasn't been created yet that would make your life easier as a podcaster?
Oh, well, I will say that what you just created has been something that, the little beacons, I think that is awesome. When you're at conferences and whatnot for people to just scan like that. Let's see, another technology. Ooh.
Could be hardware, could be software.
Let's see. I would say, hmm, that is a good question. I wonder. I'm just thinking about the whole beacon thing. If there's a way that it can not only share your podcast, but I don't know how you would do this, but somehow like you would get information of the other person's podcast. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Oh, so almost like a pod swap of sorts, right?
Yeah, I
Almost like
wonder.
how do we connect to each other kind of a thing.
Yeah, that might be something that would be interesting. Um,
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting thought. I will definitely look into it and see if we can come up with something that makes sense in that frame. So thank you for that idea. And by the way, for those who don't know what Sarah's talking about, we have these podcast beacons, little NFC based key fobs and wristwatches, and you just tap your phone on here, and it'll take people directly to your podcast or landing page of your choice. And lastly, are there any podcasts that you're listening to that are your absolute favorites, the kind that when a new episode pops up, you are stopping everything else that you're doing to go listen to this, or ones that you just will absolutely never miss?
oh, well, I subscribe to over 50 podcasts, so I'm trying to think. Branded podcast, that's with Larry Roberts and Sarah Losi. They're both familiar or popular people in the podcast space. There's a lot of podcasts I listen to that are about podcasting, but there's too many of them, so I'm not even gonna uh, start to list those. I would say After Hours Entrepreneur with Mark Savant. That's also one that I enjoy. Let's see. Yeah, most of these are podcast related.
That's okay. I mean, obviously, our audience is a little bit more podcast centric. So if you have a couple of good ones there that you like, and to those who don't get mentioned, it's okay. Don't take offense. She said she has a lot of them.
yeah. Oh, a non-podcast one is the Email Sound Booth with Liz Wilcox. She was actually on Survivor. But yeah, she just launched her podcast recently. But yeah, as far as podcasts about podcasting, of course, School of Podcasting. I mean, everybody knows that one. Podcasting Business School, podcast workflows. Yeah, there's a whole bunch, but yeah, those are definitely ones that I always listen to.
All right, very
And
good.
this podcast too, Podcasting Tech.
Oh, thank you. That's a double promo. Podcasting Tech and a podcast beacon mentioned in one shout. We appreciate you, Sarah. Check is in the mail. Once again, chatting with Sarah St. John, entrepreneur, author, podcaster. Check out the Frugalpreneur both in audio and book version. And if you're looking for help growing your show, podcastmarketing.agency, and we'll have links to everything in the show notes. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.